Welcome to What the Theory with your man Joel. I'm Joel, and today we're going to be talking about something that I personally believe in, and it's not something I had planned to talk about for a while, but on Twitter, as you know, everything is the truth, and people are demanding the truth of something called Christian atheism, which I talked about myself possessing. Now, there are so many ways I could go into it, and there are ways in which it would become sort of a ridiculous exercise of going round and round, where people may think I'm either mocking the faith or I am, trying to just take a deliberately obtuse position, which is the last thing that I want to do. But I want to take maybe 5 examples to talk about things from 5 perspectives to show you why I take this quite seriously. And if you're interested, we can do a much deeper dive into it. So, what is Christian atheism? I think I'll start by saying that I was born and raised an Anglican. That means I interacted with the faith, I went to communion, I had, all the things that are necessary for you to be called a good Anglican. And over time, my relationship with the faith was such that I took it seriously. And in high school, I ended up giving my life to Christ. I said the sinner's prayer. And the thing that convinced me, I think, to take it for more than just a belief that I think most people who are Christian, they sort of, will do what they need to do. They'll go and attend Mass on Sundays. They will talk about Christian understandings, but in their everyday life, they probably only call on God when they need some money or they need rescuing from something. It's not something that they take too seriously, but, they believe in God. I think by becoming saved or becoming a born-again Christian, I took it increasingly seriously. I said that if this is a matter of life and death, if God demands something of us, we should take it seriously and it should affect the way we live our everyday lives. Along the way, if you've read my blog, which I think I'll link to in this episode, Musings of a Timid Observer, I talk about the deconversion of Anthony. Me, I'm Anthony. I know I said I'm Joel, but I'm also Anthony. Go figure. Now, the first 5 entries on that blog talk about me arguing with the hermeneutic temptation, arguing against the fight between reason and faith, finding that there is no evidence that a physical resurrection happened or that the creation story doesn't make any sense. And genuinely, I think a lot of people believe that and are resistant to that faith. But what I didn't understand is that there are several theologians and several people who are believers who don't take those things literally. And when you argue against that, you're arguing against a straw man. And I think my move was, I was one of those people who didn't take those things seriously, or I didn't take them, not seriously, but I didn't take them literally when I was Christian. And then I fell through fundamentalism to becoming a fundamentalist atheist. And I think that swing is what Nietzsche talks about when he says God is dead. The part about God is dead that people rarely talk about is that it was a sad thing. It was, what shall we do for ourselves, the people who've murdered God? How shall we speak of the horizon when we have wiped the horizon from where we are? He talks about it being the birth of nihilism. And I fell into a deep nihilistic place. By that I mean the source of all meaning. Like, if it's not true that God exists, then what can exist? And that was the temptation and the fear that I think prevented me for a long time from talking about this, because it was actually quite dispiriting to think about, well, what does it all mean? Where did we come from? This organized religion thing doesn't seem to be having any facts on the ground. It seems to be an institution that's protecting people and power structures that already exist. So in the midst of that, I came across the idea of Christian atheism. And what it is, it's saying that rather than saying you can either be an atheist or a Christian, it is that at the core of Christianity is atheism. And at the core of it is the letting go of the belief of a transcendent Father, a transcendent being that looks over us and takes care of us and is sort of directing the universe, and realizing what that belief actually means, that there need not be a physical being or an existent creature like that for that belief to work, but in fact that the belief does work, and that the way we position that belief culturally and personally makes all the difference. So that's what I'm going to try and talk about. I think that you can't understand the trajectory of Western thought, you can't understand the trajectory of a lot of modern thought, of the way we relate as a species to the divine without going through this. And yeah, so these are the 5 points I'm going to be making. I hope you can follow along. So the first point under Christian atheism that I want to talk about is what happens at the cross. The interpretation of what happens on the cross is that God, the Messiah, in the form of Jesus Christ, sacrifices himself for the sins of man. He dies on the cross and pays the price for which the Old Testament, or as if you are Jewish, if you look at it as the scriptures of your faith. I think sometimes calling it the Old Testament is a bit of an aside to them, but it is what it is. That by dying, Jesus paid the price for sin, and sin entered the world through the disobedience of people, and that his sacrifice then meant that we were relieved of everything. But the more I think about what happens on the cross, the more I agree with the Hegelian take, which is that what died on the cross was not just a man, it was God. And what does that mean, that God died? If you read the blogs I was talking about, I used to find it really ridiculous, and a lot of atheists do find it ridiculous, the fact that, well, Jesus kind of knew that, you know what, let me spend a few days in the grave, I shall be tortured a little bit, and then immediately I'll go to paradise and everything will be hunky-dory and I'll be raised up to becoming the greatest. That, I think, is taking Christianity back into a pagan place. And by pagan, I don't mean it as a sort of pejorative. I mean it in terms of the difference between what the Christian faith talks about, or the Jewish faith and the Abrahamic faiths and all other religions, is that you cannot have an instantiation of the divine. You cannot have a fetish object. You can't have something that you raise up to the level of a god and push all your desires upon it and think that you can define it. It's undefinable. It is a space, it is a veil, it is something beyond. You can't even have a name for it. I mean, if you read a lot of the Old Testament, even trying to say God's name is something that was beyond us. But that's a story for another day. At the cross, when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? If you believe that, you have to believe that God at that point in time stopped believing in himself. God looked beyond and said, in the midst of my struggle, in the midst of this pain, you as my transcendent Father, why have you left me in this position? And to me, that's a beautiful idea. It's a beautiful expression that within this separation that we feel from goodness, from divinity, from the all-giving source of meaning and the transcendent, basically, that split, that failure to reconcile was transposed back into God himself. That barrier, the Christians will tell you that the stumbling block is the one that becomes the cornerstone. In that way, the stumbling block, which is sin, our incapability of reaching God, that very same thing is the foundation of what the Christian faith is meant to be. It's not coming to eradicate that difference by saying, oh, now God has come and picked you up and brought you to himself. Instead, God came and became a man. And by doing that through the Spirit, we now share in the communion of the saints. We now share in being God, that God no longer is something that is beyond us. The veil has been torn and he has come to us. It has been imminent. The other thing about the cross that I see is that it's a political statement. Christ came and talked about the kingdom of God. He talked about bringing a sword. It's really interesting how much Jesus' interpretations, if you listen to Christian conservatives, they talk about God and family values. And it's interesting that Jesus doesn't deal a lot with his own family. He's always hanging out with some prostitutes, with some tax people. He's dealing with the dregs of society. He's dealing with Samaritans. He's dealing with people that the faith and the religious would always look at as outcasts, as the other. And he actively participates with them. The only people that I saw him actually being rude to were the religious and his own family. not for them being his family, but for them thinking that the relationship that they had with him somehow was more important than the mission of bringing God's own children into the fold. So he's come to bring a sword to these earthly connections. And the Christian atheist reading to it is that as a political institution, the kingdom of God is not something that is yet to come. When Christ says it is finished, it was actually finished. The work has been done. But I think it's almost like, I don't know about you, but sometimes when I get something that I really want, I'm hoping that there's still something more that I need to accomplish. That this can't be it. I couldn't have arrived. And I think this is what Christianity is now stuck in. It's stuck in waiting for the second coming. I mean, wasn't the first enough? Was there something that he didn't accomplish? Was there something that was not said or done? Was there no relief? Was the Spirit not given to us? That's the question that a Christian atheist would have. It's that, the work that was finished is something that has been misunderstood, in that we again sought to raise up Christ and make him God. We still want God to be beyond us. We still need that big other. And we are, in a sense, rejecting the power thereof. There's a verse in the Bible that talks about, many people call me Lord, Lord, or people claim, the power of the Christian message without actually embodying it, without actually living it through. And I think the reading of the cross that we have is that that's the place where the idea of a transcendent God dies and God becomes us. A beautiful way that Terry Eagleton has put it is that it's the part in faith where God doesn't ask us to trust him, but God trusts us. He trusts us with his Spirit. And with that means that everything that we need is within the community of the faithful. The second is also looking at another part of the Bible, which is I think, is it Song of Psalms or Song of Songs? Different Bibles call it different things. And in that, I want to talk about the temptation to discard the flesh, to think of the flesh as evil. In the reading, or at least if you talk to many people of the faith, they'll talk about how our bodies are evil, our carnal desires are terrible. Now, to a certain extent, I believe that. Saint Francis and Saint Augustine both talked about how in sex, that sex has been ruined by the fall, by the sinful nature that we possess. But it's specifically odd when you look at how animals have sex and how you look at human beings having sex. If we were to treat sex in the way that we say, well, it's a gift from God that's meant to be, about procreation, and if you're having the kind of sex that doesn't lead to procreation, that you are actually going against God's nature. I mean, animals, they have sex in a sort of brutal manner. It's just, you have an itch, you scratch it, you're done, I'll see you next week. But for us, we think about it with meaning. We think about all the things that it represents. We can debase ourselves in it. We can elevate ourselves in it. And the Bible doesn't shy away from talking about it. If you read the Song of Songs, there's talk about breasts and all manner of bodily functions. And every time I've had it read in the faith, it's talked about as, this is an allegory, it's a nice way to clean. They try and clean it up and remove the dirty parts. And I say, no, you have to read it directly. Read it as it's mentioning it. It's that God is instantiated in our very expressions to each other. It's in the messy, it's in the bodily fluids, it's in the sweat, it's in the ways in which we fail to provide for each other. Lacan sort of talks about love as giving what you don't have to someone who doesn't need it. Now, I don't want to go too deep into that, but it's really sort of about misrecognition and how we elevate each other and we add more than is necessary. And that's the only way for us to actually enjoy things. Reality is not something that you can ever endure without a fantasy. Fantasy is not just an imagination of Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. It is more about what meaning do you provide and what symbolic order do you bring upon the actions that you take. And so it's impossible for you to think about everything, including sex, without bringing in the idea of the divine. And so for us, it's about, don't read the Bible with sort of this hermeneutic temptation. Another example, this is the example I think that Slavoj Žižek uses. It's the one of the book of Job. Now, the book of Job is one of the oldest books in the Bible. And you notice it has a very different structure from all the others. I mean, it talks about the devil roaming the earth and presenting himself as a son of God. And there isn't sort of an antagonistic relationship. It's almost like the accuser or like the devil's advocate that exists in the Catholic Church. He's sort of an agent of the will of God. And when Job's family is destroyed, when he's sort of put into a terrible proposition, Job doesn't react like you would think any other faithful person would. Like his friends actually come and say, well, maybe this is a reading that, God is punishing you for doing something, or God is testing you, that there is some reason. That's what the hermeneutic temptation is, to try and find a reason above what is plainly obvious and say that, oh, it must be because of this. Now, when God confronts Job in the later parts of the book, God doesn't show up as human, doesn't show up as loving, as sort of something that could be engaged with. It shows what it would mean to deal with a being that doesn't know of human plight, that doesn't understand suffering. God is a sort of removed entity, autonomous unto itself. And as long as that happens, there is no human that could actually ever find himself in God. And the odd thing about it is Job fails to fall into the grips of ideology. What is ideology? Ideology gives a sort of narrative and a meaning behind the everyday, behind the mundane, behind things which don't necessarily have a cause. We are always under the temptation to find a meaning, to find a telos for everything that's happening. But the reading of Job that we have is that there is no such meaning. Like, those children lost their lives. He lost everything he had and got stuff back. To be tempted to read that as, well, all of that happened so that Job would become a better man and get a better family. No, those things just happened. It's not that it was something that has some deeper meaning, that you're supposed to extract something that is going to, I guess, make you more transcendent or understand what God is. If anything, it was God understanding what man is. The other reading is from the veil on Mount Sinai with Moses. So when Moses first meets God, not the burning bush, but when he's interacting with God after they've left Egypt, God says, "No man can see me and live." Now, if you remember the series that I was doing on nothing at the center, I was saying that the only way to understand of abstract things such as numbers, such as something as beauty, is it is not something additional that you put to nature. It's not like if you add up everything in the universe that you then have the universe plus one, which is God. No, it's that God is not outside of something as an entity. It's an abstraction. It's like the same way I can say the number 5, and even if you look till the end of time, you will never find 5 out there in the world. But it has impact on the world. When Alan says 5 minutes to the end of this recording, it's a powerful thing, although there's nothing new, nothing added, there's nothing substantive being added. And that break, that symbolic power, that symbolic order, that big otherness is what God is. And the veil is what creates the feeling of substantiality behind it. I want to press on this point a little bit deeper. There's a discussion around the Wizard of Oz, and the wizard was only as powerful as the veil that prevented you from seeing him. When the veil was lifted and you saw it was just a guy, it's not like all the things that everyone was doing weren't being influenced by the idea of that wizard. So the wizard was real as long as that veil existed. So that veil that prevented you from seeing the void that is God allows you to then speak in the name of God. It allows you to then, as it were, God has a name and not a face. Why? Because in the name, in the word, we make things real. The Lacanian view is that our minds are structured as a language, and because of that, our language almost requires an acknowledgement of nothingness, an acknowledgement of a void, the acknowledgement of zero, which is nothing added, but is the basis under which everything can make sense. I don't know if that's landing. But I think that for me is the clearest description of what Christian atheism is. It's that God is important. God is a powerful abstraction of all the great things that we want to achieve. It's our understanding of the universe. It's how we tell what is and what isn't. But that idea that it is a being, idea that it is a person, idea that it is a father only comes into being because of us, because we are humans. And it's the reverse thing. Because we are the image of God, God can only see himself through us. We're a reflection back to him as to how we can symbolize the eternal. I'll close out here by talking about my own relationship with this. I spoke about the symbolic order and all of that. Just as a recap, I would say the mind, if you look at it in a psychoanalytic way, is structured like a language in three ways. One is the imaginary. That is stuff that you see. It's not imaginary in terms of picturing something different that doesn't exist. It is the ways in which we take from appearance meaning. The way when you see someone in a suit, you understand what that means in terms of this means business. When you look at me, you can tell that I'm a man just from the way I'm presenting myself. It's not about truthfulness. It's about how images allow us to navigate the world. The other is the symbolic order. It is what is the meaning behind certain actions, behind certain phrases, and those are almost communally agreed upon. Now, between the symbolic and the imaginary is a gap. There are things that prevent us symbolizing. There are things that we can only refer to without actually encapsulating. And when I talked about the big other, the psychoanalytic point of view is the big other doesn't exist. But the big other is necessary, even though it doesn't exist in an instantiation in terms of a real being, because we need something to perform for. We only think of ourselves by creating two things. You can't exist as a solipsistic being. The interesting joke is always about the meeting of the solipsists is all about them insisting that everyone else is a figment of their imagination. But they need those figments to think that they actually exist or that they don't exist. So ultimately for me, if you say, do you believe in God? I believe in the power of God. I believe in the power of belief. I understand that once you believe in these things, they motivate and cause you to cause changes in the world. And to me, that's the healthiest way of understanding it. I think the ultimate end of Christianity is atheism. Not atheism in the Richard Dawkins type of enmity towards God, because there you still need God as this tyrant that you need to work against. Instead, I think of the sublation of God into coming into the community of the people. I think of the resurrection as the resurrection of the body of who we are, of believers. The kingdom of God is here on earth. I think that's why the Bible talks about whatever you do unto the least of these, you've done unto me. The command was for us to love each other. It was not to build big temples. It was not to get prosperity. It was not to amass riches. It was for us to, assume the will of God in the actions that we take. To pray to God and say, well, bless this person, to me is paganism. You are there. Wherever you are and wherever there is love, that is the will of God, and you are the one to act it out. And it's a really deeply political feature. It's a radical one. It says to us that, you must love and the authorities of this world will kill you. That's why whenever you see the cross, the authority of this world will kill any kind of emancipatory try to relieve the people who are poor, to bring health to those people who are suffering, to bring hope to hopeless places. And everything else, the supernatural, this need to think of the supernatural still coming to rescue us, is going back in the Old Testament. We are here, we are the church, we are the community that is meant to make the will of God real. And that's all I care about. Now, if you've enjoyed this, or if you think there are more questions that you want to have answered, please respond, let me know. We can do a whole series in which we break down all the structures of Christian atheism. It's something that I'm still also finding peace with, but I think it's a great dialectic to move from fundamentalist belief to fundamentalist atheism, to resolving those positions by understanding that there is truth in both of them. Thank you very much for watching What the Theory. Like, subscribe, follow, and I'll see you next time.